Turn.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I trust this change in schedule gives me 5 more minutes. All right. I'd like to speak a few minutes this afternoon about biodistillate fuels and emissions in the U.S. Here is an outline of some of the topics I plan to cover. First, I'll briefly mention some of the drivers for biodiesel and biodistillates, and then, perhaps in a way, backing up to talk about some terminology. I've already thrown a term in here that maybe some of you haven't seen before, the term biodistillate, which is more general than biodiesel. I'll say a couple things about fuel composition and properties, then discuss emission standards from vehicles and engines and controls to achieve those standards. Then finally get to something that the organizers asked me to talk about, effects of fuel composition on emissions. I have to say a few words about mobile source air toxics, or MSAT, and then finish with some conclusions and recommendations. Okay, first the drivers. Well, why are we interested in biodiesel? I think today the simplest and most direct answer is because it's the law. That chart there, the bar chart, was shown earlier this morning in iGraph form by Howard. It shows the requirements for different forms of renewable fuels under the renewable fuel requirement standards of US EPA. And I don't know if I can get this little pointer to work. It's this faint blue bar that's the biodiesel. And I'm showing it just being constant because the volume hasn't been defined beyond today, where we are 2013. But roughly 1 billion gallons a year of biodistillate. But of course, all these other drivers come into play, the reasons for the law, the concerns about greenhouse gas emissions, the desire to have renewable or sustainable energy sources, and so on. You can read the rest. The one I want to draw your attention to is at the bottom. At least in my opinion, air quality and health concerns have not been major drivers for interest in biodiesel. They're there, they're somewhat important, but they've not been the main drivers. Okay, some terminology. Biodiesel fuel is something we all talk about rather freely. It's defined by ASTM to be monoalkyl esters of long-chain fatty acids derived from vegetable oils and animal fats. Pretty clear definition. EPA has a very similar definition. It's also known as trans-esterified triglycerides or as fatty acid methyl esters. You often see the term FAME, that is fatty acid methyl esters. Often it's referred to as B100, I saw that this morning, but not B20. B20 is a blend of biodiesel and other materials. Another fuel that is not as well known, not as prevalent today, is called renewable diesel. Renewable diesel is produced from the same feedstocks as biodiesel, but it's produced through hydroprocessing technologies, so the product is a hydrocarbon, not an ester. Another term for this is green diesel, and there's a particular commercial version that's out in the marketplace called NEX-BTL that perhaps a few of you have heard about. But that's not the end of biodistillates. Here on the next page, I got 2 more. There's something called co-processed renewable diesel. That is very similar to renewable diesel, except that it is produced in a process in which it's co-mingled with petroleum feedstocks and go together through a hydroprocessing technology to produce a single product. That single product, then, is a mixture of bio and fossil hydrocarbons. And then there's a whole other range of fuels that generically could be called cellulosic biodiesel fuel or synthetic biodiesel fuel. These would be produced from a variety of feedstocks, but many you can think of as lignocellulosic feedstocks, so grasses and woods. This, of course, requires a very different type of processing, either gasification or pyrolysis or some combination of them. And in those cases, there's generally required rather significant upgrading before you actually reach a marketable fuel. Now, I put all of those different versions of biodistillates on this one single chart, showing here the feedstocks that are used, the processing technology that's employed, the fuels that are produced, and the chemical type of the fuel. And I'm just going to draw your attention to a couple points here. First, there's a whole bunch of different fats and oils that could be used. This is an abbreviated list shown here. The line at the top is the traditional biodiesel production pathway, using methanol in a trans-esterification pathway to produce biodiesel and glycerin, We haven't heard a lot about that, but glycerin is the main byproduct of biodiesel production. About 1/10 as much glycerin is produced as biodiesel. Notice that all the rest of these fuels, whatever we call them, do not produce glycerin. Also notice that all the rest of those fuels are hydrocarbons. It's only the biodiesel that is oxygenated. A word about feedstocks and production volumes. It was already mentioned this morning, and I think this afternoon too, that at least in the US, soy oil is the dominant feedstock by far. There are lesser amounts of a whole bunch of other things used. In Europe, rapeseed is the dominant feedstock. And in several other regions of the world, palm oil is the dominant feedstock. The total production of biodiesel in the US is shown here on the bottom chart. These are production volumes in millions of gallons per year from the years 1999 through almost the present. And you can see rather severe ups and downs. That tells you something about the impact of mandates and incentives. Today, we are at an all-time high, over 1 billion gallons a year. This is 2011. 2012 figures, I haven't seen the finals, but they're also about 1 billion gallons a year. To put that in context, the total U.S. petroleum diesel fuel production is about 60 billion gallons a year, and gasoline is about double that. I mentioned already a couple differences compositionally between biodiesel and renewable diesel. This table summarizes a few important properties about distillate fuels in general, and I've highlighted two that are most important in this comparison. First one is oxygen. I've mentioned it before, I'll emphasize it again. Petroleum diesel, renewable diesel, whatever those other names are that you want to use, do not contain oxygen, whereas biodiesel has roughly 11% oxygen. That translates into energy changes too. The bottom line I've highlighted, which shows the energy content of those fuels expressed as 1,000 BTUs per gallon. Again, a very non-SI unit, but used commonly. You see, petroleum diesel has a high energy content, 130,000 BTUs per gallon. Biodiesel is noticeably less, 121,000. Composition of biodistillates. With conventional biodiesel, there are two main properties that you need to bear in mind and have important implications on the way that the fuel performs. One is the chain length of the fatty acid. These are produced, of course, from the triglycerides, have 3 fatty acid groups. Those fatty acid groups are generally C16 or C18 in length, 16 or 18 carbons in length. So the length of that is important. The degree of unsaturation within that fatty acid chain is important. Having too much unsaturation makes for an oxidatively unstable product. Having too low an unsaturation level leads to a product with poor low temperature performance. It waxes up. Now, compared to biodiesel, conventional diesel is rather different in these areas. First of all, it has a broader molecular distribution, roughly C12 to C24, could be even lower and a little bit higher. It has lower unsaturation overall than biodiesel, and it has more branching of the hydrocarbons. Those are important for physical and chemical properties. I want to show here a couple of depictions of the chemical profile of common biodiesels or biodiesel precursors. So I have soybean oil on the left and rapeseed oil on the right. The x-axis is the carbon number. So C10, 12, 14, 16. There's about 10% straight chain C16 compounds in soybean oil, but most of it's C18. This is with 0 double bonds, 1 double bond, 2 double bonds. So the dominant species in soybean oil is this species, linoleic acid, 2 double bonds. That's rather highly unsaturated in terms of fuel stability. Rapeseed is different. It's still almost all C18, but here it's mostly C18-1, 1 double bond, or oleic acid. Turning now to emission standards and controls. Diesel engine or vehicle emissions are regulated by EPA and by some states, most notably California. There are different sets of standards that are defined for different applications, different purposes. I've broken this apart two ways. One is by the size of the engine, so light duty, medium duty, heavy duty applications. Each of those has its own set of emission standards, and in fact there are subsets of each one of these categories. There also are different standards between on-road and off-road applications. Off-road is a significant part of diesel fuel usage. It includes railroads, mining, farming, major users. They have different standards. Historically, there have been 4 criteria emissions regulated as diesel emission concerns. They're named here: hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen, and particulate matter. Of those 4, it's been NOx and PM that have been of greatest concern and have been under regulatory scrutiny for the longest time, and most attention is paid to them for air quality reasons, principally. I'd like to show here what the standards are. These are not static sets of numbers. They evolve. They continue to evolve. But I've shown here what some of the major time stamps have been in emission standards for diesel engines. I mention engines and vehicles because some applications it's the engine that's regulated. In other applications, it's the vehicle that's regulated. Emission standards have become much more stringent over the last 25 years. And those 2 criteria emissions I mentioned, the PM and the NOx, have been reduced. The requirements for the emissions have been reduced by almost 2 orders of magnitude in my lifetime, most of your lifetimes. I show that here. This chart is a logarithmic scale. So NOx, back in the late 1980s, NOx was regulated at roughly 10, I think it's 10.5 grams per brake horsepower hour. Now there's a unit for you. That's the way these laws are written. So roughly 10 units. Today, it's 0.2, so almost 2 orders of magnitude. Similarly, PM. Here it was 0.6 grams per brake horsepower hour. Now it's 0.01. So dramatic changes. Of course, those emission standards apply to new vehicles, new engines. They're not automatically applied to the in-use fleet. So it takes a long time to turn over a fleet. Much longer time to turn over the heavy-duty diesel fleet than the light-duty passenger car fleet. Well, how is it possible to achieve such dramatic reductions in emissions? There have been rather significant changes in engines and emission control systems in just the last few years, really. And I mentioned a couple of things here. In terms of engine improvements, many things have been done. If you're an engine guy, you'd know a lot more about this than I do, but I've mentioned 3 of them that are rather significant. The adaptation of high-pressure common rail fuel injection of variable amounts of fuel and variable timing, and then, of course, the computer. Really, these vehicles are computers on wheels, the electronic monitoring and control systems. In terms of emission control systems, sometimes called after-treatment systems, very recently, there have been introduced into new vehicles, new engines, particulate traps to collect PM. Of course, those traps require regeneration. There are some issues regarding regeneration of those traps. To control NOx, selective catalytic reduction systems are now in place on new engines. Those involve injection of urea to reduce NOx to a molecular nitrogen. Those are pretty significant changes just the last couple of years. Well, then you ask about the fuel. Ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel has also been introduced in recent years. And the primary reason for having that is to enable satisfactory long-term operation of those sophisticated emission control systems. It's rather analogous to getting the lead out of gasoline so that catalytic control systems can function properly. Now, turning to emissions. The traditional understanding of what the impacts of biodiesel are on terms of tailpipe emissions comes from EPA reports. I'm citing here a rather famous but never officially published report from 2002 from EPA, in which you'll see this chart, and you'll see this reproduced hundreds of other places from people interested in emission standards ever since. What it's showing are some nice smooth curves shows that as you increase the blending level of biodiesel from B0 all the way to B100, you can expect rather significant reductions in hydrocarbons, CO, and PM. And at the same time, you'll see a slight increase in NOx emissions. That increase in NOx has been a source of tremendous controversy in a lot of studies over the years. It even has a name. It's called the NOx effect. And that's the subject of another talk or two, so we won't get into it. Just accept that that happens. What I want to draw your attention to is the bottom statement here. In most real-world applications, biodiesel is used at low concentrations, usually B5 to B20. So it's this region in here that we're most interested in knowing what happens to emissions. Well, that basic study and understanding from EPA mostly derives from data from the year 2000 and earlier. More recently, Desert Research Institute, on behalf of the Coordinating Research Council, did conduct an updated literature review study to look at more recent information, perhaps a little more comprehensive information. We looked at over 1,000 literature sources, selected the data from these sources following a set of criteria that requires a legitimate comparison, did all sorts of different sorting and statistical analysis. And what I want to show you is what the data really look like. Remember those nice smooth curves from before? Here's what the data really look like. And I'm just showing one example here for NOx emissions. We're expressing this in the same format as from the EPA document. So it's the change in emissions from a petroleum-based fuel to the use of the biofuel as a function of increasing biodiesel content. So from B0 to B100. You notice several things here. A lot of the data are at discrete levels, like B100 or B20. That's where most of the data are. Makes it a little difficult to interpolate all the other points. Second thing you'll see is this data are all over the place, really tremendous scatter. And you understand why. This is looking at a whole range of literature sources. It's not just one study that did a bunch of vehicles or under common conditions. This is a very wide range of conditions, many different forms of biodiesel, blended into different base fuels, and all those sorts of differences. But I still want to give you a flavor of what the data really look like. You get this much variation, which makes it difficult to truly ascertain the impact of a change in fuels over an entire fleet. Notice another thing in this. We really do show that same upward trend in NOx as biodiesel increases in this category of heavy-duty, medium-duty engine dyno emissions. Different category, chassis dyno, that's where you're running the whole vehicle on a dynamometer. You see the opposite trend. Kind of interesting. To put it all together, I've reproduced the EPA chart here again, which is the nice, smooth, solid lines, and then put on top of that the conclusions that we drew based on a little bit more recent review of the literature. And honestly, they're pretty close. I think this is reasonably good agreement. We both show the same NOx effect, and both show rather significant decreases in NOx, PM, and CO with increasing biodiesel. So I think this is probably the best idea you can get as to the impact of biodiesel use on emissions across the whole fleet. I want to focus for a moment on B20 because, as I mentioned, that's really that's the upper end of the most common range of biodiesel usage levels. So on just the B20 usage, I'm showing here our results for different classes of engines. So it's the medium-duty, heavy-duty engine, the chassis, and the light-duty. Big reductions in hydrocarbon, reductions in CO, reductions in PM, and NOx perhaps an increase, with the big scatter around them. But that agrees quite well with EPA, and I've highlighted that down here. 21% reduction in hydrocarbons for EPA, 17 in ours. So good agreement overall. As I mentioned, we had a very extensive database looking at over 1,000 studies, so we were able to sort this across various areas of interest, such as the biodiesel type. Was that biodiesel made from soy? Was it made from rapeseed, from yellow grease, something else? By the base fuel into which you're blending the biodiesel. By the engine year, and really by engine year, what you're looking at is the certification levels for the emissions, in particular the NOx certification level. And then whether it's a heavy load or medium load, the type of cycle being run. And the bottom line here is that this large data scatter really makes it difficult to detect significant effects across the whole fleet. And I'll illustrate that in a couple charts here. This is showing the effects of the feedstock, the biodiesel feedstock, on emissions. So we've got here soy, rapeseed, tallow, yellow grease. And it's hard to tell much difference. Considering those error bars, you really cannot tell much difference from the type of biodiesel feedstock. Similarly here, the type of the base fuel, it's difficult to determine whether there is an effect. The engine year that is being tested, you can try to tease out some things here, but you can appreciate also the variability that's in front of you. And finally, the effects of the test cycle, the load, the amount of work being performed by that test cycle. So I mentioned something about MSATs, mobile source air toxic emissions. There are, I don't know how many, a couple hundred MSAT-specific compounds. Those that are of greatest interest with respect to biodiesel include the few I've mentioned here. Total PM, which we've already discussed. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which has very little data in the literature, and in fact, I can't show you any, there's so little. But the one that has garnered some attention is aldehydes, or oxygenated emission species. In particular, formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, propionaldehyde, and acrolein. You might think that biodiesel, being an oxygenated molecule, might lead to increased oxygenated mobile source air toxics, such as these aldehydes. In reality, I don't think the data are sufficient to support or refute that hypothesis. The existing data are just sparse and variable, and I will show you one chart to illustrate that. This is the emissions over those 1,000 different literature studies I was looking at, 1,000 different references for formaldehyde emissions. Plotting here the biodiesel, emissions in the biodiesel case versus the emissions in the base petroleum diesel case. The solid black line is a one-to-one line. So some studies for biodiesel are higher, some a little lower, very extreme variability again. I don't think you can draw much conclusion from that. So let me go to a few conclusions in summary. First, right now, biodiesel, the FAME version, is the dominant version of biodistillate volumes. But I believe that in the future, the non-oxygenated biodistillates are likely to grow and maybe even become the dominant form of biodistillate. The recent reviews of the biodiesel literature have confirmed what EPA and others have shown for many years, that hydrocarbons, CO and PM, are reduced with a straight blending of some B level, while NOx increases a little bit. The emissions from the non-oxygenated biodistillates are pretty sparse, but there are a couple sources out there. I didn't elaborate on them. It does look as if renewable diesel, that's the hydrocarbon version, non-oxygenated hydrocarbon version, does give you just as big, if not bigger, emission reduction benefits than biodiesel. Standards have been reduced dramatically the past 25 years. That's led to advanced emission control systems that reduces emissions dramatically, much more so than a change in the fuel composition. Final set of conclusions here. Determining the fuel effects upon a whole fleet, the whole fleet-wide emission effect, is difficult. I think I've emphasized that. The high variability does prevent drawing firm conclusions about the effects of biodiesel feedstock, the base fuel type into which you're blending the biodiesel, the engine model year, and other things on truly understanding the biodiesel emissions effect. While the data are sparse, the biodiesel blending does not appear to affect aldehydes in a dramatic or consistent way. The effects on pH are very hard to ascertain, but for the few data that are out there suggest little effect, if any. The final thing here is more of a recommendation. These advanced diesel emission control systems that I mentioned, the selective catalytic reduction device and the particulate trap, have only been in use for a short time, a couple of years. And I believe that additional research and study and monitoring is needed to assess the effects, the long-term effects of biodiesel on the performance of those systems. If those systems fail or are shortened lifetime, that would have a significant effect. With that, I think I'll conclude, and thank you for your attention.